It probably wouldn't be hyperbole to say that Resident Evil is one of the most influential franchises in the history of gaming. The longest running survival horror series, and while others came before, Resident Evil truly defined the genre, and much like Genghis Khan, you can find its DNA even in the most modern survival horror titles. As with everything though, the times change and even the most beloved series needs to move on or risk becoming irrelevant, and while Resident Evil had refined the formula a bit and tried mixing things up with ideas that ran the gamut of patently stupid and too ahead of its time, the most recent release up to 2005 still very much stuck with the sensibilities of the PS1 titles. Something had to change, and change they did, because in 2005 they released Resident Evil 4 and breathed new life into the old bones. Still regarded as one of the best games in the franchise to this day, it is arguably one of the greatest things to ever happen to the franchise, and also one of the worst. Okay, put your pitchforks down, douse your torches and molotovs, and let me explain. With the remake just around the corner, or already out, depending on when I upload this thing, I thought it would be the best time to discuss Resident Evil 4, the best and worst thing to happen to the Resident Evil franchise. Let's start with all the good things that the game actually brought to the table. Partly because it hopefully placated the angry mob outside my window, but mostly because it's how I wrote the title. First of all, and arguably the largest change from earlier titles, is the camera. That doesn't sound even remotely momentous, but I assure you it is. You see, the mainline RE titles until now had all been fixed camera angles. For the young and uninitiated, this basically means the cameras didn't move with the player, and only switches to a new angle when the player moves out of range. This was mainly to ensure environments would be of good visual quality, but as a result led to issues with such as awkward aiming, enemies being able to attack you out of shot, disorienting transitions, and of course let's not forget the dreaded tank controls. The problem with tank controls is the controls were relative to the character and not the camera, which is great for dealing with rapidly switching camera angles, but can be, and were, pretty janky and awkward for people not used to them. RE4 moved away from this and swapped it for an over-the-shoulder camera, which solved pretty much all of these problems. No more up, down or forward aiming, no more weird Dutch angle camera bollocks, and finally, no more tank controls. Was there? RE4 still uses tank controls. Finally, more easy to understand tank controls. It also had the welcome side effect of opening levels up, because if you'll notice from previous titles they're all corridors, the new camera finally let us go outside, connect with nature and get beheaded with a chainsaw. Feel that fresh air. It even meant they could introduce more intricate puzzles and varied enemy encounters, as opposed to just shooting Zeds down a tunnel. Another massive change they made is to the inventory system, and I am now very much aware how shit this all sounds, but they are truly massive changes. Now, Resident Evil has always had a very small inventory of 8 slots, and it was pretty weird to be honest. For some reason a key took up the same space as a grenade launcher. Figure that one out. Actually was to force players to balance out what they needed to survive and what they needed to progress. Issue is needing to know what puzzles need what and where, so for new players you could probably spend an annoying amount of time walking back and forth between safe rooms and item boxes, and that can become infuriatingly tedious for new players. RE4 fixed this. Let me just interject here. I don't mean fixed like it was a terrible idea. It wasn't, and they literally brought it back for RE7 and the remake of 2 and 3, just that it can be a bit of a turn off for new players, by giving key items a separate inventory from the rest of your gear, as well as doing away with the arbitrary item slots and introducing the attaché case, aka the greatest inventory system in gaming history. And I say that without a single hint of hyperbole, but in this case it does a very special thing. Modernises the old slot system while also keeping the spirit of it, because every weapon, ammo and healing items takes up a set amount of boxes in your inventory, with weapons taking up more based on their relative size, meaning you still have to balance out your resources if you don't want to be murked repeatedly, because while you can carry an absolutely unhinged amount of firearms, if you have nothing else, then you'd better get good at using that knife of yours. It also did away with item boxes, so backtracking really isn't a thing anymore, but we'll get to that kettle of fish later. Finally, the game did something that no other games in the franchise had. Made the game accessible. And I don't mean accessible in the modern sense with, colorblind mode and the like. I mean made the game easier for people to get into with a little thing called adaptive difficulty. Be honest with yourselves, Resident Evil is a hard series, at least in the earlier titles. You know it, I know it, Steve the Doorstop Penguin knows it. You can easily get caught in situations where you just can't progress, or progression feels nigh impossible because you don't have the health or the ammo to do it without playing perfectly, which, for a newbie, probably is asking too much. RE4 introduced adaptive difficulty, and it's as simple as it sounds. The better the player is, higher accuracy, hitting headshots and avoiding damage, the difficulty increases. Enemies dodge more, are more aggressive and deal more damage. On the flip side, if the player is struggling, like by missing shots or generally being beaten up by the locals, the game gets easier in the opposite way, to the point where certain enemies just don't spawn. This ultimately means that players can generally improve at their own pace, without being too heavily punished for doing poorly. Regardless how you feel about this system, I know some people really hate it, it does make it more accommodating for new players, and for those that don't want to deal with it, there's always professional. The game also removed the requirement for ink ribbons to save, so you could save whenever you need without having to use a finite resource. That's also related to that kettle of fish we'll talk about later. So from what I've mentioned so far, RE4 has done something that is very difficult to do: modernise a franchise in a way that doesn't super alienate existing fans while also opening it up to newcomers. And they did this all without losing that weird B-movie action nonsense that has prevailed the entire series so far. Sounds like an absolutely amazing thing for the franchise. There's no way there could be anything bad about this. Or is there? You see, while Resident Evil 4 is a high point of the series, it marked the start of a downward spiral of the franchise that culminated in that. Let's begin with an issue that I've been alluding to for a bit. The game is exceptionally linear. After the village section, which loops on itself a bit, the story just becomes as straight as a ruler. It goes from scene to scene to scene, and you never backtrack for anything. Just a straight shot of interconnected corridors. Let's compare this to earlier titles which are more akin to Metroidvanias really. Get a thing that enables you to explore an earlier area that was previously locked, so progression snakes all over and constantly double backs on itself. But you said newcomers hated backtracking. No, I didn't. I said they'd probably get really annoyed having to backtrack without knowing what is needed where. But with RE4's new inventory system, they could have easily kept some of that design philosophy without any of those frustrations. But instead we get breadcrumbed down a beaten path with little to bordering on no real exploration available to the player. Second, we have puzzles. Now, the older games have some pretty intricate puzzles that sometimes bordered on the esoteric, but solving them ultimately felt good, like you'd overcome something. The puzzles in RE4 are basic, to say the least. They aren't terrible, just they aren't very difficult. They don't require a lot of thought on the part of the player, and can be pretty easily brute forced. And that's when they're even puzzles. Main problem is most of them rely on just shooting a thing to stop another thing. I mean, there are some cool puzzle mechanics for certain bosses and enemies, the Garradors for example being blind, but there just really isn't much to get your teeth into. Thirdly, we have the big thing that everyone even passingly familiar with the game would have already assumed I was going to talk about from the title alone: how hard the game leans into the action. It's not super obvious in the beginning, but when you get to the end of 2-3, let's just say it takes a turn. Smaller enemy encounters get ramped up to hordes and just escalate from there. The castle begins just flooding rooms with dudes, giving them shields, crossbows, and even RPGs for God's sake. And that's not even the worst of it. You get to the island in chapter 5.1 and they throw a small army at you. Not a joke, by the way, they are literally armed with guns and everything. it kind of devolves into a weirdly janky third-person shooter. It also means balancing of resources becomes less of a thing, because rather than having to decide whether it's worthwhile to shoot a zombie blocking your path with your very limited ammunition, the game just gives you a functionally infinite amount and more or less forces you to fight everything. You even get an attack chopper to help you through one section. In fact, that leads me to another aspect of the action lean. Its heavy usage of set pieces and QTEs. They're actually pretty much one and the same, but both are worth talking about separately. We've already discussed the sections where the game just wave assaults you, but then there's the catapult shooting gallery, minigun alley, and of course the impractical death coaster. Sidebar, but how does this make any sense? Who builds a mine like this? And I'm not going to talk about the dumb Salazar statue. And then there's all the QTE sections. Oddly, I don't begrudge the game for using them. It's hard to have a fast-paced action sequence with the gameplay mechanics they have to hand, but so many are just very repetitive and become tedious as time goes on. This isn't to say it doesn't have its slower, more tense moments. The Regenerator Lab and the Verdugo bosses are very much reminiscent of the old school, but for the most part the horror just takes a back seat. Finally, we have the absolute worst thing Resident Evil 4 did. It was successful. That sounds really stupid, but bear with me here. RE4 did really well and showed Capcom that people like this new direction. The survival horror light, if you will. It's why RE5 is a lot more action oriented, more linear, and why there are basically zero puzzles in the entire game. Also, sidebar again, but why did they remove the attaché case and replace it with the 9-slot inventory? And then there's RE6, and if you watch my video on the game, you'd be hard pressed to find actual gameplay past all the QTEs. But then, to counter my own point, maybe the franchise going in that direction, to the point that it could have literally just died, was what Resident Evil needed. If it kept going the way it was, it probably would have held its cult following, but may have just faded into the background, archaic and all but forgotten. You can see how they meshed the new with the old and again breathed life into the grandfather of survival horror. What do you guys think? Was RE4 the second coming or the beginning of the end? Let me know in the comments below and maybe leave a like and subscribe while you're down there. I am the Resident Gremlin, and if they're hell bent on remaking the entire series, I can't wait to see how they fix 5. Ignore 6. That shit is terminal.